Hello and welcome to the KEA Advisors webinar on the Parts Inventory Health Check. This is Heidi with KEA Advisors. I'll be administering the webinar today, and your panelists today are Amber Kelzer, the Director of Business Intelligence here at KEA Advisors, and Keith Ely is joining as well. He's the founder and managing partner of KEA Advisors. If you haven't been on one of these before, I'll just let you know if you do have questions. There is a question box in your control panel. You can just type it and I will see them and relay them to our presenters. And please ask at any time and I'll get the questions to them. With that, I'll hand it off to Amber and Keith.
Hey, great. Thank you, Heidi. This is Keith Ely, and thank you again for joining us for half an hour today. We're going to spend about 30 minutes talking about Parts Inventory Health Check. And it's something that we've introduced in the last 6 months. Amber Kelzer, who's our Director of Business Intelligence, I'll introduce her in a minute. She's going to take us through what the Inventory Health Check is, but just a little background on why we did this in the first place. We had some requests from customers of ours over many years, really over about 25 years of advisory work, to look at their parts inventory and to look at frozen capital, why parts weren't on the shelf when they needed to be for an increased fill rate, why costing was a concern when they're doing parts inventory reconciliations. Hey, I've got duplicates or this same part number, but in a different vendor. How can I relate those and know which one is the less expensive to have on my shelf, or which one should I keep on my shelf? And finally, tell me a little bit about my pricing structure as well. What price codes work? What are my prices by source or class? And how does my pricing look? And more importantly, if I want to change it, what might that look like going forward? So we started this idea of a health check to look at these things in the inventory. And another item had entered into this in the last probably year, which is vendor managed inventory. And really starting to get a feel, is vendor managed inventory doing what it should be doing? I want to just stop right there and let you know that we at KEA Advisors are a really big fan of vendor managed inventory. We think that when it's properly used, when the inventory is strategic, not strategically, but built right on the dealer side, in accordance with what reality is from a stock control, a stocking criteria standpoint, when the inventory is accurate, when we know what's on the shelf from account wise that is actually on the shelf, 98, 99% of the time it's in the right bin, that we're following our procedures and our practices right, man, vendor managed inventory works well, and we can ask good questions to our vendor managed inventory analyst. When we don't have those things in place, we can't ask good questions. And so I'm going to preface this by saying, get your house in order before you start questioning vendor managed inventory. Because if you don't have your house in order and understand what your inventory should look like, you can't have good dialogue with vendor managed inventory analysts. This parts inventory health check is very strategic as well. Okay, it starts dealing into strategy, not just the data that comes out of it.
All right, guys, welcome. And I want to add on specifically because Keith mentioned the idea of looking at your inventory in two pieces, the vendor managed side and the side that's managed in-house. I just want to add a little bit of color around that vendor managed. Specific to the case study I'm going to show you today, the opportunities we saw in the vendor managed side are the same opportunities we saw in the house managed side. So when it came to asking, which is better, us managing our inventory or vendor managing our inventory, the reality was our house wasn't in order and the same opportunities existed on both sides.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We learned that when we looked at the, we've done several of these now for several large sophisticated dealerships that we would say are really leaders in the parts inventory world. They're really good at managing inventory. But as they've asked us to look at this, what we found with them is that the impact on their vendor managed inventory versus what you're calling house managed is essentially the same. And a lot of it is driven by how we do work, what our practices are, and then the outputs of this really identify where those holes are. I guess we got to say too that when we look at the return on investment that the dealers are seeing on this, that's actually there, even we could say potentially there, it's really high in terms of cash and sustained gross profit increase as well.
And by really high, 318%.
Way too high to probably talk about, right?
All right, so what is it? It's really a look at the basic strategy for managing your parts inventory, but it's also a snapshot in time of how well you're doing against that basic strategy. So it allows you two pieces. A, it allows you to look at where can you get cash out of your inventory without negatively impacting any of your metrics. And B, it takes a look at how you can increase your gross profit by aligning your pricing strategies and moving the dial on your profitability. And then once we're sort of right sized, right part, right mix, right price, it really looks at how do you maintain that as well. And that's where the strategy piece comes in.
Yep. You know, I think Amber, before we go through this list of the 5 items, that from a purpose standpoint, I think it's really important to be clear that the dealers that we've engaged with this on, they understand that they're the ones that have to execute this, right? We're the ones that provide the data and the guidance, but without executing on it, things pretty well stay the same. So, you know, we look at these 5 items, we talk about eliminating waste in the inventory. I guess that's excess.
Yep.
Certainly this idea of first time fill rate, off the shelf fill rate, looking for the right part on the right shelf at the right time.
It's pretty critical for your own ability to run the business as well as customer satisfaction.
But we do that also by trying to lower the inventory investment as well.
Make it easy to find the right part.
You talk about, and I know you'll talk about as we go through this, increasing, where's opportunities to increase gross profit? Well, we know that it's not on every part, right? There's some very commodity type parts that are really hard to increase margin on. We might do it from better acquisition price, but certainly not for selling at a higher price.
Nope. Our goal is to understand the strategy behind our pricing and actually eliminate the waste within that strategy.
I guess that takes us to the last bullet point which is that there's transparency across the locations, across the stores. So we see and understand the inventory better at those locations.
One of our goals is to provide tools that allow you to see not just the inventory across each store, but the need inside the inventory across each store. So if you need part ABC123 in the Lawrence, Kansas store, you can look at all of the stores inside your dealership and see that Lawrence needs 3 and Kansas City has 4 available for transfer inside of their inventory. And maybe there's 2 more in Dallas and maybe there's 3 more in New York. But you can see where they're at and who can transfer them to you and then make your decision.
I know all the DMSs have that transfer feature, but sometimes it's not quite as sophisticated or analytical as what we're talking about here. It's usually more quantity driven than how many you might need in the future.
Yes, I would also say you made that sound really complicated because you're so smart. And there is a lot of analytics behind it, but we tried to give it to you in a very simple format.
Yeah, that's true.
We wanted ease of use to be very, very easy for you, even though kind of the math model that goes behind it is pretty complicated.
Okay, cool. Let's get on with it. Let's talk about what we got here.
All right. So there's really 5 steps to the analysis. And the first one is really looking at, are we right sizing our inventory? And I think an opportunity we've seen is that folks want to start with their current inventory and say, what do I need inside here and what don't I need? And I think something that makes our analysis unique is we didn't look at your current inventory at all when we decided what is in your ideal inventory. We said, if you could turn the page today and have the perfect mix of parts on your shelves, what would it be? And we looked at the demand, meaning that we looked at sales, the last rolling calendar year sales, to decide what your ideal inventory would be. And then we compared it to the current inventory to look at what the differences were. The next piece is looking at where you're buying your parts. What vendors are you using, and how many times are you buying the same part from different vendors, and how does that affect your costing? Then we start looking at if we get the right mix of parts and we're buying them at their lowest cost. You know, how are we lining out our source and our cost across multiple stores inside the same dealership? How are we pricing our price codes and our parts across multiple stores in our dealership? And then how do we look at transfer opportunities as we right size that inventory? And I think last but not least, we get to that ideal state and then we maintain it through great processes and audit forms.
Yeah, that's good. So I know you mentioned a two-store example. I know that these were the ones that you've been doing are for, well, I guess one that's about a 10-store group and one that's 30 stores in that range. So,
Yes.
so I'm interested to talk through this with you because it's fascinating stuff. So I guess our first piece of this is to right size the inventory.
So without looking at your inventory, we're going to look at what the demand is. We look at the sales over the last 12 months and we say what parts are we selling, how many of them are we selling, and how many of them should be stock status parts. And that's really where we craft the ideal inventory from.
Okay.
It's just that pure demand.
I know you use the term 30 days here. Why a 30-day supply? You know, I think that's been the question that we've been asked by customers. And I think what we know is that in most cases, a 30-day supply is adequate. We're not going to run out if we're following those practices that we talk about, right? That discipline of ordering in a certain cycle.
Well, think about how long it takes to get a stock order in. It certainly doesn't take 30 days. We order multiple times a week. And so if we have the right processes in place, a 30-day supply, make sure we always give it to the customer, but then our routine should allow us to continue to fill it to a 30-day supply.
I do know that that's not really true though. That 30 days is not really true because you do a roundup on this, right? So
I do.
If
We
it
can't have
calculates,
half a part.
right, if it calculates to be 0.2683 of a part, we're always saying keep one in stock. So even if it's 0.001, it's going to say keep one in stock.
If we're selling enough of it to have it in stock, we have to have a whole one.
Right,
And if we
so-
need 2.5, then we need 3.
Yeah, so we're always rounding up on that. So it's really not 30-day supply. It's a variance off that. And I know the other thing you've looked at is multi-packs, multi-quantities, whatever you want to call that. You know, hey, the system says you need 3, but the vendor says you have to order the filters in a box of 6. So we're going to round that up and keep 6 on hand. So,
Yeah.
so it's, even though we use 30 days as kind of our starting point, again, we get a little more sophisticated in it to look at it to say, we're going to round up, we're going to base it on what the order, not quantity, but how the order package is coming from that vendor. So
We've also looked at bulk discounts.
Oh.
When a dealership can order for all of their stores at once, we can also factor that into what our supply should look like.
interesting. Great. So what do we find?
So like I said, this is just a small sample set, and we have some rounded numbers here. But we had 2 stores, and their current inventory values together were 4 million. So 2.8, 2.2 million is what they currently had sitting on their shelves. We took a look at the demand for parts in their stores and what should qualify for stock status, and we found they should only have, instead of 4 million, 3.1.
Okay.
So we found almost $1 million of opportunity. And if you look across each stores, the first store had 1.1 million of, I'm not going to use the word excess, but extra parts. Some of
Okay.
them shouldn't have been in stock status at all.
Okay.
And some of them, they just had too many.
Okay.
And then the second store, we found $800,000 of opportunity in terms of what they had versus their ideal situation.
I do know that when we had the conversation with the dealer on 2 of their stores, because that's what this is, 2 of their stores, that the big thing that we emphasized to them was not just the cash opportunity, one-time cash opportunity, but that last sentence that says the first-time fill rate going from 81.5 to 96%. I don't think any of us really believe that we're going to get the 96% or the almost 3 or 2 million in cash. But I think what we do know is there's a tremendous upside for this.
There is
Right.
going to be some cash, and there is going to be an improvement in fill rate at the same time.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
this is an ideal scenario. However, I think that's why we don't want to call it excess, because we're changing the part numbers in your inventory. Some will
Right.
stay, some will go, but the quantities will change and the part numbers inside your inventory will change to allow you to net that opportunity in terms of dollars and to net that fill rate back.
So
on the
that
part.
ideal inventory value, the 1.7 and 1.4, includes both this parts that we don't need because there are too many of them or they shouldn't be there, adding back in parts that we should have that aren't there right
Absolutely.
now. Okay,
Shortage and excess, as well as parts to add.
so it's
and
a net number.
Yep.
It's a net number. Cool.
Step 2 is a really unique analysis where we take a look at all the parts in your system and where you're buying them. And then we start bucketing them by like parts. So you have a group of 6 part numbers in your inventory, and they're all the same part, but they're bought from 6 different vendors. And by knowing that, we can isolate who's your cheapest vendor. And maybe that's not the way you want to look at that, but isn't it kind of the way you want to look at it? So what we can do is we can say, if you have, 5 of each of these part numbers, so a total of 30 parts, if you bought all of them from the lowest cost vendor, what would be your savings? Not just in inventory, but also what would be the growth of your margin? If you're selling that part for $20, regardless of the vendor you buy it from, the lower investment you have in that part, the higher the margin you have in that part.
Or we could sell more too.
Yeah.
If we wanted to lower the price, we might be able to sell a few more
You
too.
might be able to take a look and say, hey, if we always bought from this vendor, we could really cut our customers a deal on this part.
And penetrate a market. I think on this too, you talked about multiple vendors. I think we'd be foolish to say that we don't recognize the need that you have to keep some of these higher priced parts on hand, higher cost parts, because they might need to be used for warranty.
Yep.
Right. So we're not saying eliminate vendors, but just, hey, let's look at this strategically and make good purchasing decisions that align with our type of work and what we're selling.
And what I've had is I had a parts director go through and highlight, which groups of parts are for warranty, and then which of them should we really dig into, because there's an opportunity there to lower our cost.
Yeah.
And we didn't even know it existed.
Yeah.
And so it looks at your entire inventory for your entire dealership and provides that.
Interesting.
So in terms of dollars and the opportunity we saw for the same 2 stores, once again, inventory values, what we saw from a recovery opportunity is $90,000 in the first store and $30,000 in the second. And when I say recovery, that's the difference between I paid $5 for it, but I could have got it for $3. So I had a $2 opportunity.
Okay.
And so then we have our new net inventory value. Before you even look at ideal inventory or right sizing, it's just you can lower your investment in your same inventory. And then there's a margin gain, which you can see is exponentially higher.
So we're making the assumption we still sell that part for the same price and lower our acquisition price to get that margin.
Yes,
gain.
absolutely. No change in what our customer is seeing, only in what our investment to the part is.
Interesting.
So once we sort of get the right mix of parts on our shelf and we understand where we're sourcing them from, we can look at, as we make sure we move towards that ideal state, how are we moving parts across different stores to get them into the right inventory that will sell them? And also at the same time, how do we start looking at our pricing? And so we do a side-by-side of every part that's in your dealership and what source that part is bucketed under for each rooftop and what the cost is in your system for each rooftop.
Interesting.
From a transfer perspective, and Keith, you'll remember at the beginning of the year, we had a lot of dealerships reconciling their inventories. And we saw a lot of discrepancies, hundreds of thousands of dollars between accounting and the PAD. Yeah. And the idea that cost, we saw a lot of transfer issues because the costing was off between stores.
Right.
And so we transfer, in accounting, we'd transfer $300 worth of inventory, but physically we'd up our inventory $500 because the costing wasn't the same.
Gotcha. And we're going to find that here.
We are. So what we saw, same stores, is that when we looked at the parts, we had, and I will tell you between these stores, we had around 30,000 parts. We had 11 to 1,200 parts that had different sources in the system between just 2 stores. We had
source meaning bucket, because not all the DMSs uses that term source, right?
Yes. What bucket
the
is
bucket that they're in? Okay.
And then from a cost perspective, we had over 350 parts that had a different cost between the 2 stores.
And when we're talking cost, we're not talking average cost. We're talking the acquisition cost, correct?
Yes, the acquisition cost that's sitting in there.
Okay.
And then in between those, we had 115 that had discrepancies in both.
Okay.
They had a different cost in a different bucket. And then if we looked at our ideal inventory and we said, you want to get from point A to point B, you still had multiple parts, large buckets of parts that had issues in terms of source and cost that would need to be corrected so you could transfer some of that inventory between rooftops.
So this should help with this, getting our costing right and pricing too, because pricing is driven off the buckets that they're in, right?
Yep.
So,
So first we look at our mix and how we're moving them across stores, and then we focus on our pricing. And this step's really important in making sure both of those go smooth.
cool.
So now we really focus on the pricing evaluation. So what is the structure for your pricing? What price codes, buckets are you using? Who is the customer? What are the individual parts they're buying? What are the sources they buy from? And we really start slicing and dicing that data all the way from the margin of a price code to the margin of a specific part. And we break it apart as we go along by source, by customer, by source and customer, so that we can see between your stores, what are the opportunities, as well as within a store, where is the opportunity in your pricing structure to go address it, and that will increase your profitability.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that you guys have told me as you've done this is when you start talking to I think this dealer was an example of it, that maybe their pricing structure and pricing strategy wasn't as in place as they thought. When they looked at price codes, they saw customers that didn't make a lot of sense in certain price codes.
They did. They would look at which customer was in the price code, how much they were selling, and what the margin was. And not only would they see discrepancies in what they assumed that customer was getting from them, but then when they looked at that same customer across stores, they realized that customer gets a different price across stores.
Okay. What did we find on this one?
So in our first store, as you look to align that pricing strategy across both stores, we expect a margin increase over 6 months of just shy of $400,000, and just a little over $300,000 in the second store as well.
Interesting.
Yeah, just for 6 months of aligning your pricing
So
strategy.
even if we're only 10% right, we're in a lot better shape.
You're in significantly better shape. And more importantly, our customers are getting the same pricing from us.
Okay.
Last but not least, as we look to right size our inventories, focus on our pricing strategy, we're going to move some parts. We've been talking about that. We're going to move them across stores. And that's where the transfer opportunities come in, is we look at which parts qualify for transfer. So they're stock status parts. We want a 30-day supply in our inventory at all times. But we also want to look at parts that may be stock status but haven't moved recently, and we'll transfer those.
Okay.
And you'll see for both stores around $350,000 to $400,000 of qualified inventory that they have but could transfer. And because it hasn't sold, there's that assumption there that it's not going to affect your fill rate either, but it is going to increase the fill rate at the next store when you get the right part in.
Okay.
So now we add it all up. What is the total opportunity? And we really bucket this into two pieces. What's our cash opportunity? And then what's that reoccurring margin opportunity you're going to see? So when you look at store one, you see 2.3, almost $2.4 million of opportunity, and it's split about 1.2 in terms of cash, and then a little over $1 million in margin opportunity. Now, cash is a one-time thing. It's frozen capital. It's getting the right mode mix in your inventory, but the margin's going to reoccur and get stronger each year. The second store, similar. We did see a little shy of $1 million, so $830,000 in cash opportunity, and then about $750,000 in margin opportunity. And we only look at that in terms of 6 months for margin opportunity. Think about that could do in a year if we really got consistent.
The number that just keeps drawing my eye is up in your text above this, where it talks about the fill rate too. I'm a fill rate junkie, and I just think that is so huge. I mean, we're potentially lowering inventory value while selling more out of our inventory. That's kind of what the inventory is for, isn't it? To sell.
Imagine if you could go to your boss, go to your owner, and you could say, hey, I'm selling more, customer satisfaction's at an all-time high. Oh, and I put almost $4 million in the bank.
And I think we're not going. I think reality is we know we're not going to get $4 million in the bank again off this, because we're not going to recover $2 million of cash, but if we can recover a quarter of that, 20% of it, we probably can do better than that. I mean, you're talking about for this dealership group, you're talking about some real dollars when it starts to, when you look at the other stores that are included in this.
Yep.
You know, it's real dollars, and not that if you got 20% of 2 million for a 2-store group, that would be real dollars as well. So I think we know we're not foolish enough to think we're going to get $3,920,000, but I think we know that it's a lot more than zero too. The zero that's there as well.
Absolutely. And there are stages to the strategy to go about this. Some of it is lower hanging fruit. It's easier to execute.
Yeah.
And some of it does take a little bit more collaboration to execute as
Yeah.
well. So what's great about this dealership group is they're hungry to achieve it, and they're definitely making progress.
Good.
All right. So this is the strategy piece. We've idealized our inventory. We're sourcing our parts from the lowest cost. We have the right mix. Our pricing strategies are aligned. We've moved the parts where they need to go. And so we're starting to we've seen some cash in the bank. We're seeing a little bit of margin increase. How do we maintain it? And that's where we provide that KEA Advisors standard of what are the daily, weekly, monthly routines to maintain your inventory. And I will tell you guys, week 1, a lot more routines than on week 21.
Right.
Once you start to get to a better place, the check and balance to maintain it is a lot less work.
I know that we go through this a lot, and man, the first 2 months are just painful because I don't have time to do that.
Yep.
Right, that's feedback, and then about 6 months into it, this is pretty easy, and my inventory looks pretty clean now, and it's getting better all the time. So I think that inventory accuracy piece is just huge.
So we provide that standard process as well as the audit form to make sure that you're doing it, to maintain the progress you made out of this analysis.
Cool.
So really basic strategy. If you ever played blackjack and you know what the basic strategy is and how to beat the house, that's what this is. Learn the rules, play them better than anyone else.
You'll have to teach me that one sometime.
All right. So just to recap what you saw here. So the opportunity overall to increase cash on hand was 2.1 million for these 2 stores. The margin opportunity, which also affects your total absorption in a positive manner, is just shy of 2 million, 1.97 for this study. Fill rate improvement was almost 15%. And then you can compare these same metrics across your house managed and vendor managed inventory as well.
Excellent. And I think this, again, speaks to the strategic initiative of this as well. It's not just a one-time tactical thing, right? It's very strategic in terms of trying to produce throughput in the shop by a fill rate, or trying to strategically identify places to improve margin or whatever else that is. This encompasses a lot of things that impact not just one department. It impacts several departments.
Absolutely.
So how do we get started on this?
Call me.
Call you. Call you.
All right, so it's pretty simple. Provide us access to your data and we can really start to move forward. You can see my email address here. It's real simple. It's amber@keaadvisors.com. But email me today and we could get started on your parts health inventory check. We can look at additional ways you want to look at this data to make it the most useful tool for your dealership today.
Yeah, I think that's what I find interesting is that even though it's 5 steps here, you guys customize this a lot for people.
Every dealership gets a little bit of a different layer because it makes the most sense for them.
Very good. Amber, thanks for taking time.
Thank you.
This was exciting.
Thank you guys for spending a bit of your lunch break with us here at KEA Advisors.
Thank you, everyone. We'll take any questions you might have.
Not seeing any questions at the moment.
Okay.
We'll give it just, oh, here we have one. How does minimum supplier order fit into the analysis?
We do take that into account. It's going to be based upon what the vendor says the minimum is. In some cases, that's going to impact that 30-day scenario because we know that there's some vendors that it may take 6 weeks to build up enough demand or enough of a stock order to bring that in to bring those parts into stock. So we're going to factor that in as we start to look at the day's supply. That's part of that customization that Amber, you talked about.
Yep. We'll just have a conversation with you about what the parameters are for your minimum order quantities. And then we'll calculate still a 30-day supply, but anytime we have to go above a 30-day supply, we'll just up the quantities, and your ideal inventory dollar amount will account for that.
Okay, another question. What about costs to transfer from store to store?
We don't factor that in. Again, we're looking solely at quantity that's needed at one store versus what's on hand at another that supplying store is not using. We don't factor freight cost or delivery cost in. Certainly something you would want to do as you look at this, but we don't factor that in.
What you can see in that transfer tool, though, is if you're looking for a specific part, you can see where it's available across your dealer group, and then you'll know more about what the freight cost is based on the distance between you and the dealership it's coming from. So you'll be able to see the quantities in each of the stores in your dealership.
And that was a question that I know the analysis that you showed us that group had, right? Was
yes.
We don't want to go from dealership that's 800 miles away to another one. We need to start looking at how our dealerships are grouped and start to move parts in that manner.
And another question. When you have the chance to volume buy something, say a truckload of one part number brake drums at a discount, are there any formulas we should be using to decide if it's worth spending the capital?
That's probably a discussion for another day. There absolutely is. It's all based upon demand versus holding cost and handling cost and other things like that. But it's probably a discussion to take offline if they want to reach out to Amber. Certainly something that we could talk about one-on-one.
I've definitely done the math on it before.
So you could reach out to Amber or Keith if you'd want to continue that discussion.
Now reach out to Amber. She's much smarter on this.
Great. Okay, another question here is, what formula do you use to figure fill rate? Seen a few different formulas for this.
So you want to take that one, or you want me to take that one?
Sure. If I was looking to compare your current fill rate against the fill rate on the ideal inventory, I'm going to look at it in terms of how many pieces have you sold in the last year, and were you able to go pull them off the shelf? My fill rate, the KEA Advisors fill rate on your ideal inventory, is not inflated with customer orders that were placed on stock orders. The fill rate sitting on your benchmark MGR does include U-type orders, which are the custom orders you roll into a stock order each time you place it. So it's actually inflated compared to mine. So when I say I would increase fill rate about 15%, it would actually increase more because I'm not counting those rolled in customer orders in my fill rate.
Yeah, our basic formula is, and it doesn't matter on the DMS because you're going to pull the data in a similar manner, but it's looking, and we always calculate by piece.
Yes.
So it's the number of pieces that you sold for the month, subtracting out the number of pieces that were ordered for a customer. And it doesn't matter if that was ordered to be delivered via stock or via emergency purchase, but those were ordered for a customer because you didn't have it on the shelf. So now we get an estimate of how many parts came right off the shelf. And now we compare that versus our demand, which is the number of pieces we sold for the month, plus our lost sales. And that gives us a demand figure. What we typically find, as Amber said in her response, the orders that are placed for the customer in many cases are hidden. They're not real because people will process orders differently. They'll code it as a stock order, even though it's going for a customer order. So we have to dig and find those. And then the lost sale piece of it is the other piece of that. But we're measuring it by piece, fill rate by piece. You can also measure it in terms of fill rate by, did you fill a ticket? We don't look at it that way in this calculation. We're looking at it strictly for this type of service, this type of analysis. based upon, was the part on the shelf when you needed it? And we're looking at it from this standpoint of, if the part sold 3 or more times in the year, what we're going to put that part on the shelf versus the total demand for that inventory over that period of time in a year. We're comparing those two numbers.
Okay, another question is, are vendor rebates part of the analysis?
No. We could factor it in, but we're looking at the right sizing in terms of part numbers and quantity. We're not taking into account a vendor rebate that says buy 6 months worth of demand, or 6 months worth of supply. And it should be taken into account. But these are starting points.
Okay, here is another one. How are specialty parts considered? Low volume, but key to a few customers.
We looked only in terms of demand when we looked at your idle inventory. Now, if we wanted to isolate those and add them in, not only can I add them into your idle inventory, but I can make sure that they're highlighted and clear which ones are special parts.
Yeah, again, going back to what Amber said earlier, this is very customizable. So if there are certain things that you would like to know more about, adding in specialty part numbers, adding in those vendor discounts, whatever it may be, it's something we can add into the study.
Okay, here's another one. With the increase in customers buying online, is 100% on-hand accuracy the goal?
It's always the goal. We'll never get there. But what the typical dealership runs in on-hand accuracy today is not high enough, I guess, or good enough to support a phone room only sales methodology, buying online if you're showing quantities on hand. The accuracy piece of this is something just vitally important that we address, not in terms of this study. Amber talked about the inventory accuracy SOPs. We're not going to train anybody on that through this study, but that is something that's just vital if you're going to move your inventory and your business to more online, more instant ordering, I would call it.
Guys, think about it this way. Have you ever ordered something from a local store and then went to pick it up and found out when you got there it wasn't there? It's because they didn't know how many they had on hand, and their system said they had it, and they sold it to you online, and then you showed up and they realized when they went to get it they didn't have it.
Right. And not only does that affect customer service, it also affects your ordering
And your
as
costing.
well.
How much did it cost you to give them that
Yeah,
part if
yeah.
you didn't have it on the shelf?
And it affects the stock order. It just affects everything. So accuracy is just vital.
Okay. Is the NADA ATD guide for inventory turns changing as a result of moving to a 30-day supply?
I think over time, again, if you look at our suggested guide, it's going to be between 6 and 8 turns in terms of gross turns. 8 is on the upside. Again, remember that 30-day number is not really 30-day because we're factoring into it a rounding up. So we're always going to keep a minimum of 1 on hand, where many inventory systems will go down as a minimum and go up as a maximum. We're saying minimum of 1, maximum of probably 2 in this case, whereas many inventories would say 0 and 1. So we're inflating that by the roundup. So it's not really 30-day supply. Probably gets closer to a 40-day supply once we do that. And that moves it into that 45-day range. History and not history, experience
There you go.
would tell us that it's pretty tough to get down below that 40-day range.
And that's all I've got for questions. Thank you so much for your participation, everybody.
Yep, thank you for the great questions too. If you have anything else, reach out to Amber. She'd love to talk to you.
Amber@KEAadvisors.com or Keith@KEAadvisors.com.
Very good. Thank you again. Heidi, thanks as always. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you again.
Thank you.